Hey guys, tonight we slip into the kind of world where shadows do most of the talking. Picture a room lit only by a stub of candle, its wax dripping like nervous sweat down the brass holder. The walls lean close as though they're listening. A woman sits there, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles glow bone white. She's not praying exactly, though it looks like prayer. She's calculating survival. You've got to remember, in centuries past, getting pregnant outside of marriage wasn't just a matter of raised eyebrows or awkward family dinners. It was the kind of secret that could cost you everything: your place in society, your livelihood, sometimes even your life. And if you're already squirming in your seat, here's a reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this little time travel experiment we're about to take. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself among whispers because whispers are safer than declarations. The air feels heavy with them, layered with secrets traded in kitchens, at wells, and inside drafty churches where women knelt more often in shame than in faith. In this dim-lit corner of history, secrecy was not a hobby. It was survival. A single slip of the tongue could be the difference between staying hidden and being dragged before a magistrate. And yet, human hearts have always been reckless. Desire doesn't wait for a marriage contract or the approval of a priest. Women fell in love, or at least into situations that left them with swollen bellies they had no way of explaining. Here's a mainstream fact to set the stage. In many medieval towns, pregnancy outside of wedlock was considered not just sinful, but criminal. Some laws ordered whipping, others demanded fines, and still others, especially in the harsher corners of Europe, turned women into pariahs. But here's a quirky little tidbit. In certain villages, people believed a pregnant woman's shame could literally seep into the crops. Farmers would insist that an unmarried mother keep away from the fields at harvest time, fearing her tainted presence would ruin the grain. Imagine carrying not just a child, but also the burden of every village's bread supply. Talk about stress. Historians still argue whether the true danger was the law or the neighbors. After all, laws were only as powerful as the people willing to enforce them. A magistrate might look the other way if you were well connected, while your neighbor's gossip could spread like wildfire even faster than official punishment. The truth is, the candle in that room where she sat trembling wasn't just lighting her face, it was illuminating the edge of a razor she had to walk every single day. The irony? The risk of death didn't always come from judges or executioners. Childbirth itself was already one of the most dangerous things a woman could endure. By adding secrecy, sneaking in midwives at night, delivering in damp barns, swallowing mysterious herbs, the danger doubled. The act of staying hidden could kill you as swiftly as the scandal of being discovered. You lean back a little, maybe picturing it too vividly now. The hush of the room, the uneven breath of a woman weighing options that all feel impossible. The sensation that the candlelight itself might betray her, flickering too brightly, casting a shadow that someone could spot through a window. This is where our story begins, not with kings and queens, not with great wars, but with one trembling woman and the choice she can't afford to make in the open. The candle gutters lower, and as you lean in closer, the glow shifts from the woman's hands to the cold stone walls. And suddenly, you realize those walls aren't just keeping her secrets, they're echoing the voice of the church. In medieval Europe, the church was everywhere, and I don't mean just Sunday sermons and choir hymns. I mean in the very air you breathed. Every kiss, every whisper, every choice about your body was shadowed by the weight of doctrine. And if you thought your nosy aunt was bad at family dinners, imagine a network of priests, confessors, and parish spies whose whole job was to make sure you didn't step out of line. The church preached that motherhood was sacred, but only if it happened with the official stamp of holy matrimony. If not, then congratulations, you were branded a sinner. The odd part? The same institution that preached compassion also wrote penalties that sounded more like cruel jokes. A woman discovered pregnant out of wedlock might be forced to parade through the village barefoot, holding a candle, confessing her fall before neighbours who pretended to be shocked but secretly craned their necks for gossip. That's not exactly the warm pastoral care most people think of when they picture stained glass windows and chanted prayers. Here's a solid historical fact to anchor us. The medieval church didn't just set moral rules, it enforced them with real, terrifying authority. Bishops had their own courts called ecclesiastical courts, where sexual sins like adultery, fornication and bastardy were tried. And no, you didn't want to be on the defendant's bench because punishments could range from heavy fines to excommunication, which basically meant social death. And then, a quirky tidbit, some priests actually kept public registers of women who'd confessed to carnal sins. Imagine your worst mistake posted on a bulletin board outside church. People could literally check a list to see who'd slipped up. If that doesn't make you shudder, I don't know what will. Historians still argue whether the church's heavy hand was more about protecting morality or about keeping power. Because here's the cynical twist. Fines collected from these so-called sinners didn't just vanish, they filled church coffers. Some critics at the time even whispered that bishops had a vested interest in keeping temptation alive, because sinning women meant a steady income. That's a business model even Wall Street would envy. You can almost hear it now, the clatter of church bells in the morning, the summons to confession, the looming dread of kneeling in front of a priest who already knows too much. And the cruelest irony, women who obeyed still suffered. The same church that punished secret pregnancies also denied married women any control over their bodies. You were expected to produce children for your husband whether you wanted to or not. Consent, as we understand it today, didn't really exist. So picture it. A woman clutching her belly beneath her cloak, slipping past the cathedral steps at night, terrified that even the statues of saints are watching her. Her sin is carved into her skin, but what really condemns her isn't God, it's the system of men interpreting His will. And just as you begin to feel the heavy toll of those rules, the candlelight flickers again, casting a shadow that reminds you. This story isn't about institutions, it's about the women who dared to live within and sometimes against them. The bells fade into the distance, and you're left on a crooked village lane where mud sucks at your shoes and the smell of smoke hangs heavy in the air. Here, you see how the price of desire was often paid by women alone. You might think of intimacy as private, something shared between two people. But in the past, the moment a woman's body revealed evidence of her secret, the consequences slammed down like a hammer. In many towns, premarital intimacy was the beginning of a lifelong punishment. A woman's reputation was her currency, and once it was tarnished, it rarely recovered. You could lose your chance at marriage, and with it, the protection and survival that came with a husband's household. No husband meant no steady home, no legal standing, and often no safe way to raise a child. And if you're thinking, well, couldn't the man just take responsibility too? Congratulations, you've just asked the question that women across centuries have been screaming into their pillows. Because more often than not, men walked away untouched, while women bore the mark of shame forever. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ground this. In Tudor England, fornication could result in fines or public whipping, but the punishments were unevenly enforced. Men were often excused with lighter penalties, while women carried the physical and social scars. It's a bit like getting called out in school. The boy gets a wink, the girl gets detention. And here's a quirky tidbit. In parts of Germany, women caught pregnant out of wedlock had to wear special garments that marked their shame, almost like a scarlet letter stitched into their daily wardrobe. Imagine being forced to do your laundry in public while everyone smirked at your clothes before they even smirked at your face. That's medieval fashion at its cruelest. Historians still argue whether communities genuinely believed they were protecting morality, or if they simply used morality as a convenient excuse to control women. Because let's be honest, A man's honor wasn't tied to the state of his body. A woman's was. That imbalance wasn't divine justice. It was a man-made rule, enforced by neighbors who loved a good scandal. Think of it like this. You're standing in the town square, the gossip buzzing around you louder than the flies circling the butcher's stall. A girl you once knew, a friend maybe, now stands with lowered eyes, holding her hands over her belly as punishment is announced. She's only a few weeks along, but somehow the whole town knows. People whisper, speculate, and even invent names for the supposed father. And there you are, realizing that desire, which should have been a tender moment, has turned into her public downfall. The cruel joke? Women didn't even need to be guilty to suffer. Rumors alone could ruin them. A flirtatious glance, a late-night walk, or even an unfortunate coincidence could spark suspicions that were impossible to shake. In that sense, the real punishment wasn't just delivered by magistrates or priests, it was dealt out by wagging tongues and sideways looks. And yet, despite the risk, women still chose love, or at least the possibility of it. Because what's more human than wanting closeness, even when society tells you it could be fatal? That's the paradox of this candlelit world. People risked everything, not because they didn't understand the danger, but because life without affection seemed like no life at all. You pause on that muddy lane, hearing the laughter of boys chasing each other with sticks, the gossiping voices of women at the well, the clink of a blacksmith's hammer. And behind it all, the unspoken rule that one slip could end everything. The muddy lane fades, and now you're standing in a marketplace where gossip is as plentiful as the cabbages stacked on wooden carts. Here, shame itself becomes a weapon, more feared than any sword. Public humiliation was one of the cheapest punishments societies could hand out, and it was devastatingly effective. When an unmarried woman was discovered pregnant, the punishment often wasn't prison or execution. No, it was being dragged into the square and made into a living cautionary tale. Picture it. She's forced to kneel on cold stone, maybe stripped down to a thin shift, with her hair unbound to emphasize her disgrace. The crowd gathers not just to watch, but to participate. Children point, old women shake their heads, men smirk or jeer. It was less about justice and more about theatre, one where the script was always written at the woman's expense. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 16th century England and parts of France, women accused of fornication or bearing bastards were paraded with placards around their necks describing their crime. Sometimes they were whipped as they walked, other times they were made to stand in church wearing white sheets of penance while the congregation eyed them like hawks. The message was clear. Morality wasn't private. It was staged for the world to see. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some towns had a custom of using the cucking stool, or scold's bridle, devices meant to publicly shame unruly women, which sometimes included those caught in sexual scandals. Imagine being locked in an iron mask shaped like a pig's snout, while neighbors threw rotten food at you. It sounds like something out of bad slapstick comedy. Except the humiliation was lethal to your reputation. Historians still argue whether these punishments were meant to deter others or simply to feed the public's appetite for spectacle. Because let's be honest, humans have always loved a good scandal. Even today, entire industries thrive on exposing who's sleeping with whom. The difference is, you're scrolling tabloids or YouTube drama channels in bed. Back then, you gathered in the square, elbowed your neighbor, and snickered at the girl forced to wear her shame like a costume. You can almost feel the weight of those eyes now, the heat of judgment thicker than the midday sun. Imagine being her, shuffling forward under the gaze of every person you've ever known, every childhood friend now turned into an accuser. There was no deleting your reputation, no starting over in a new town. Rumors traveled faster than horse-drawn carts. And here's the cruelest part. Public shaming wasn't always the end. For some women, it was just the beginning. Employers wouldn't hire you, suitors wouldn't approach you, even family members might cast you out, fearing that your scandal stained them too. Shame was sticky. It clung harder than mud. You step back, picturing the crowd dispersing when the show is over, leaving the woman trembling in the dust, her life effectively destroyed before it even had the chance to begin again. The church might have blessed the ritual, the magistrates might have ordered it, but the real punishment was the laughter, the whispers, and the stares that would follow her for years. And as the crowd melts away in your imagination, you're left with a chill, the realization that sometimes the cruelest prisons have no walls at all. They live in the eyes of everyone around you. The square empties, the dust settles, and you drift toward the edges of the village, where the cottages sag under their thatched roofs and windows are shuttered tight against both wind and gossip. It's here, in these shadows, that women found their fragile lifelines, secret midwives and hidden rooms, because for all the public shame that swirled outside, there were also quiet networks of women helping each other survive. Step into one of these rooms now, a low-ceilinged chamber lit by a single oil lamp, its air heavy with smoke and the sharp tang of herbs drying from the rafters. A woman in her 50s, a midwife, bends over a bundle of cloth, whispering instructions to a girl barely out of adolescence. The midwife's hands are steady, but her eyes flick nervously toward the door. If she's caught helping an unmarried woman through childbirth, she could lose everything, or worse. But still, she comes because she knows no one else will. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In early modern Europe, midwives were both respected and distrusted. They held enormous practical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth, yet they were also targets of suspicion. If a mother or baby died, midwives could be accused of negligence or even witchcraft. It was a dangerous profession, and secrecy only made it more perilous. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some midwives swore oaths before local courts, promising to report any illegitimate births. In other words, their loyalty was officially to the law, not to the women. But in practice, many broke those oaths, quietly smuggling infants to foundling homes or falsifying baptism records to protect mothers. That double life turned them into both guardians and liars, moving in the thin twilight between survival and betrayal. Historians still argue whether midwives were complicit in upholding oppressive systems or whether they acted as covert resistors, bending the rules when compassion outweighed duty. The truth probably lies in between. After all, a midwife had to feed her own family. She couldn't afford to be branded a criminal herself. Yet she also couldn't turn away from a desperate girl knocking at her door at midnight. You shift closer in that dim room, feeling the creak of floorboards beneath your feet. The young woman breathes heavily, clutching the midwife's hand. There's no screaming here, no crying that could alert the neighbors. Birth is forced into silence, every gasp muffled into pillows, every contraction swallowed like a guilty secret. Even the baby, when it comes, must be hushed quickly, its cries pressed against cloth. The walls are complicit. The rafters lean down, the shadows gather, the silence feels almost alive, and outside, the world is none the wiser. The village sleeps unaware, or perhaps willfully blind to what is happening just beyond the glow of its own hearths. But you know, as you stand in that hidden room, that secrecy was never full protection. If the midwife's loyalty faltered, or if a nosy neighbor spotted unusual activity, the whole fragile arrangement could collapse. In that moment, survival rested on nothing more than whispered trust and thin walls. You exhale, realizing that for these women, safety was never a guarantee. It was a gamble played in the shadows, with allies who could save you or doom you. The hidden room fades, but the smell lingers, sharp, earthy, bitter. It clings to your clothes, to your throat. You follow it down a narrow alley where a woman sits hunched over a mortar and pestle, grinding dried leaves into powder. Her lips move silently as if reciting an old recipe. These are the herbs people whispered about, passed down like dangerous heirlooms. Remedies not for curing coughs or soothing aches, but for ending pregnancies, or at least trying to. Here's a mainstream historical fact. For centuries, women used plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savin as abortifacients. Manuals from ancient Greece to the Middle Ages list them openly, even while condemning their use. They were supposed to work by purging the womb, but doses were unpredictable and the line between medicine and poison was frighteningly thin. And now, a quirky tidbit: crocodile dung. Yep, ancient Egyptians are recorded using it as a contraceptive, inserting dried crocodile dung mixed with honey as a kind of primitive barrier method. Talk about awkward pharmacy shopping. You thought buying modern birth control was embarrassing. Try asking your local apothecary for a jar of crocodile poop. Historians still argue whether women truly believed these methods were effective, or whether the ritual of taking them was itself a kind of desperate hope. Did pennyroyal tea actually prevent birth, or was it more placebo than potion? Records are unclear, but what is clear is that many women tried and many died. Overdoses could destroy the liver, cause convulsions, or simply bleed the body dry. You crouch beside the woman at her workbench. The grinding stone makes a dull, steady rhythm. She's not some cackling witch from a fairy tale. She's tired, practical, and quietly terrified. Each time she hands over a bundle of herbs, she knows the risk isn't just for the girl who drinks it. If authorities discover her trade, she could be charged with murder. If neighbors whisper too loudly, she could be accused of witchcraft. And yet, the demand never stops. Women knock at her door at night, voices trembling, hands clutching coins or trinkets to pay. Some don't even know if they're pregnant yet. They just can't take the risk of being seen with a swelling belly. Imagine drinking that bitter brew, its taste sour, almost metallic, the heat of it burning down your throat. You pray it works quickly, but instead you feel only cramps, dizziness, maybe a fever. You don't know if it's the remedy working or if your body is shutting down. And you lie there, sweating, half hoping for relief and half fearing you'll never rise again. Outside, the village hums with ordinary life. Children play, bells ring, men haggle over livestock, while inside, a young woman rolls on the floor, caught between survival and death. The cruel irony: even if she survives the herbs, the secret might still betray her. A neighbor sees her sick. A priest hears a confession, and suddenly her gamble is undone. You shiver at the thought, realizing that the scent of those herbs is more than just a smell. It's the echo of generations of whispered desperation. The bitter scent of herbs drifts away, and now you find yourself staring at a folded scrap of parchment. The ink is uneven, blotched in places where a hand trembled. It's a love letter, one of those fragile things that can turn into a weapon the moment it's discovered. Words meant to be private suddenly become the noose around someone's neck. Picture it. A young woman hides the letter beneath her pillow, thinking it's a treasure. But when her secret belly begins to swell, that same letter might be dragged into court as damning proof. Judges didn't need much to condemn. A few affectionate words like "forever yours" or "I long for you tonight" could be enough to paint the whole scandal in permanent ink. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In many early modern European trials, private correspondence was treated as evidence. Letters, gifts, or even tokens like rings could be paraded before juries to establish that a relationship had taken place. Forget modern notions of privacy. Your heart's scribbles could end up read aloud in front of a room packed with neighbors. And here's a quirky tidbit. One 17th century French case recorded a woman being convicted of fornication because her lover had sent her a pair of embroidered gloves. Apparently, romance was so dangerous that even fashion accessories could testify against you. Imagine your socks being hauled into evidence as proof of seduction. Historians still argue whether courts were genuinely interested in protecting morality or if they simply loved the drama of putting intimacy on public display. After all, nothing drew a crowd like scandal. And a juicy love letter, half smudged with perfume, half torn from panic, was irresistible. You lean in, almost able to read the words yourself. They're simple, earnest, maybe clumsy. "I will be with you when the moon is high." Sweet enough on their own, but under the harsh candlelight of a courtroom, they sound like an indictment. You can almost hear the murmurs of the crowd, the priest's disapproving cough, the magistrate tapping his quill as though already writing the sentence. For the woman, it's devastating. What was once a token of love now testifies against her. And the cruelest irony, the man who wrote it might never appear in court at all. Women were the ones forced to stand in judgment while men could vanish, conveniently forgotten by the record keepers. You pause, feeling the fragility of ink and paper. How something so delicate, so human, could be twisted into evidence of sin. And you can't help but think of your own messages today, typed into glowing screens, floating across invisible networks. If history repeats itself, someday even those might be dredged up in places you'd never want them read aloud. The parchment curls slightly in the heat of a nearby flame, and the ink shines briefly before fading into shadow. What was once a whisper of love has become a trap, a reminder that in this world, even your own handwriting could betray you. The parchment crumbles into the fire, and the ashes swirl upward like secrets that refuse to stay buried. Step outside now into the crisp air of a narrow street where the law itself stalks quietly, waiting to pounce. Because beyond the gossip, beyond the church sermons, there were actual written codes, laws that carried the force of iron. And for women with secret pregnancies, those laws were merciless. A magistrate's desk might look unassuming, wooden, ink-stained, scattered with parchments. But each one of those documents carried the weight of life or death. Some laws fined women for bastardy, others ordered whippings. And in certain harsh regions, infanticide was punished by hanging, whether the woman had intended it or not. The assumption was cruel. If a baby died in secret, the mother must have killed it. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 1624, England passed the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act. It declared that if an unmarried woman concealed the death of her child, she was automatically presumed guilty of murder unless she could prove otherwise. Imagine being forced to prove innocence while grieving. Proof of innocence wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, courts required women to undergo invasive tests to prove whether they had recently given birth. These could involve examining the body in humiliating ways, all in front of officials who had no medical training. Picture your private life dissected in the most public, degrading fashion possible, with the outcome already stacked against you. Historians still argue whether these laws were written out of genuine fear of infanticide or whether they were simply blunt instruments to control women's bodies. After all, society wasn't nearly as interested in holding men accountable for fathering illegitimate children. If anything, laws gave men more freedom to abandon, while binding women tighter in chains of suspicion. You walk past the magistrate's bench now, hearing the scratching of quills as clerks record names, offences and punishments. Behind each line of ink is a woman whose life is unravelling, a servant girl dismissed from her post, a peasant driven from her village, a noblewoman whispered about in court corridors. The law of silence wasn't just about shutting women up, it was about making sure no one could speak on their behalf either. The silence becomes heavy in your ears. Imagine being told not to cry out during childbirth because the sound itself might draw unwanted attention. Imagine being unable to mourn a child because tears could be interpreted as guilt. Even grief became suspicious, twisted into a sign of crime. You stop in the middle of the cobbled street, listening to the echo of your own footsteps. It's eerie, this sense that laws meant to bring order instead bred fear. The very people writing them never risked the pain they legislated, and yet their ink scarred thousands of women, leaving behind lives that flickered briefly, like candle flames snuffed too early. The ashes from the parchment drift into the night sky, and the street returns to silence. The law, cold and unblinking, waits for its next victim. The magistrate's desk fades, and suddenly you're back among crooked houses where windows hang open just enough for curtains to twitch. It isn't parchment or law that threatens you here. It's the neighbours. You probably know the type, the ones who water their gardens, but really just stand outside to collect everyone else's news. In medieval villages, gossip wasn't idle chatter. It was surveillance, sharper than any sword. Step carefully down this lane. You hear it before you see it. Voices clustered at the well, women leaning on buckets, trading whispers disguised as casual remarks. "Did you notice she's been ill every morning?" one says, raising her eyebrow. Another replies, "Her dresses don't fit quite the same." It doesn't take much. A slight pallor, a missed Sunday service, a loosened belt, and suddenly your whole life is an open book written by other people's tongues. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In many rural communities, midwives and matrons were required to report suspicious pregnancies to the authorities, but they often didn't need to. Neighbors did the job for free, fueled by rumor and a desire to guard community morality. These informal networks often acted faster than the law itself. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, if a woman was accused of secret pregnancy, the community would force her to undergo the bread and cheese test. She'd be made to eat dry bread and hard cheese in front of witnesses. If she choked, it was taken as proof of her guilt. You'd think they were running a medieval game show. Choke or confess. Historians still argue whether gossip networks were genuinely motivated by piety or simply by entertainment. After all, life in a small village could be crushingly dull. Scandal broke the monotony like a festival. And keeping track of who was meeting whom behind haystacks was practically a public pastime. The cruelest part? Gossip didn't need to be true. Once a rumor took hold, it was almost impossible to shake. Even if you gave birth safely, even if you raised your child, whispers followed you like shadows, twisting every smile into a smirk, every silence into an accusation. You walk past the well now, hearing the giggles cut short as the women turn their backs. You feel eyes prick at your skin from behind shutters. The whole village watches without admitting they're watching, policing without uniforms, condemning without trials. And you realize it wasn't the priest or the judge that most women feared first. It was the neighbor leaning over the fence, pretending to pick weeds while keeping an eye on your waistline. The punishment began long before the law arrived, woven into every whispered word, every sidelong glance, every curtain twitch in the night. You step faster, heart thudding, as though someone might already be whispering about you. And maybe they are. The whispers at the well dissolve, and now you hear something softer, more haunting. The faint cry of an infant carried on the night wind. Follow it, and you arrive at the heavy oak doors of a church. They're scarred by centuries of hands pushing them open, but near the base you see something stranger, a carved slot, almost like a drawer. This is the foundling wheel, a device where babies could be left anonymously. You push it gently, and the wood creaks as though sighing under the weight of centuries of secrets. Here's a mainstream historical fact. By the Middle Ages, many European cities established foundling hospitals or baby wheels built into convent walls. A mother could place her newborn inside, rotate the wheel, and ring a bell. On the other side, nuns or monks would take the child in. In theory, it was a mercy, an alternative to abandonment in fields or rivers. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these foundlings were given surnames like Esposito in Italy or Trouvé in France, literally meaning exposed or found. Imagine carrying your origin story as a last name everywhere you went. It's like having your scandal embroidered into your identity card. Historians still argue whether these systems were compassionate safety nets or thinly veiled tools for social control. Sure, they saved infants, but they also allowed communities to pretend they were merciful without addressing the deeper cruelty that drove women to desperation. And the survival rates? Dismal. Records show that in some foundling hospitals more than half the infants died within the first year, many from neglect or disease. You linger at the door as another shadowy figure approaches. A woman, cloaked and trembling, cradles something small against her chest. She glances left, then right, as if the stone saints carved above the archway might judge her. Then with shaking hands, she lowers the baby into the wheel. The bell rings faintly, its chime more mournful than holy. She steps back, lips pressed shut, and vanishes into the darkness. Inside you hear the shuffle of feet, the rustle of cloth as the child is lifted away. The nuns will give it milk if they have any, maybe baptize it with a name from their endless list. But the truth is harsh. That child has already been cut from its lineage, stripped of heritage, condemned to anonymity. And outside, the mother walks alone, her arms suddenly empty, her secret both erased and eternal. No one will speak of it tomorrow, yet everyone will know. She will return to her life, pretending nothing happened, carrying the silence like a stone in her chest. You stand at the church door a moment longer, feeling the cold iron handle, listening as the bell's echo fades into the night. The wheel is still. The street is quiet, but the air is heavy with the weight of all the children who passed through that narrow slot, and all the women who risked everything only to leave part of themselves behind. The church door drifts into shadow, and now you find yourself among high stone walls and manicured courtyards where the stakes are even higher. This isn't the cramped village anymore, it's the hushed corridors of a noble estate. The gossip here is cloaked in velvet, but the danger of a secret pregnancy is sharper than any peasant punishment. For noble women, the risk wasn't just shame, it was bloodlines and betrayal. Imagine it. You're a young duchess, promised in marriage to secure an alliance between two powerful families. Your womb isn't yours, it's a vault for dynasties. Producing an heir is your single most valuable task, and every child you bear must be legitimate. But what if your heart strays? What if your body betrays you before the marriage is sealed with heirs? Suddenly your secret isn't just personal. It could topple treaties, redraw borders, even start wars. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Noble women across Europe were constantly monitored for signs of pregnancy. Queens and princesses were subjected to lying-in rituals where noble witnesses attended births to confirm legitimacy. That wasn't just ceremony, it was surveillance. A stray pregnancy outside marriage could delegitimize an entire lineage. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Renaissance France, one scandal erupted when a noblewoman was rumoured to have given birth in a castle tower and hidden the child. Servants whispered of smuggled linens and muffled cries. To this day, local legends insist the castle is haunted by a phantom baby's wail echoing through the stairwell. Talk about a family ghost story you don't want passed down at dinner. Historians still argue whether noble women had more freedom because of their power or less freedom because of the scrutiny. On one hand, wealth gave them access to private rooms, loyal servants, and maybe even sympathetic physicians. On the other hand, their every move was monitored by courtiers, ambassadors, and scheming relatives. Privacy, ironically, was almost non-existent at the very top. Walk with me through a grand hall now. Tapestries hang heavy with gold thread, but the whispers are heavier still. A countess adjusts her gown, her eyes darting nervously toward her ladies-in-waiting. She wonders which of them would betray her if they noticed a swelling belly. A queen touches her stomach in private, rehearsing excuses she may never need but can't stop imagining. The walls here don't echo, they record, and the court never forgets. In these estates, a single rumour could ripple outward into entire kingdoms. An illegitimate heir didn't just threaten a marriage, it threatened succession, property rights, entire dynastic futures. If the wrong child was born, armies might march. You pause, hearing faint laughter in a side chamber, courtiers sipping wine, speculating behind fans and goblets. They smile politely in public, but their whispers cut sharper than swords. And somewhere, in the chambers above, a woman prays her secret never leaks into those gilded halls. The polished stone halls dim, and the heavy gold curtains give way to plain wooden doors. You slip quietly inside and find yourself surrounded not by courtiers, but by rows of nuns, their voices weaving together in low, steady chant. At first it feels serene, candles flickering, incense rising, the hush of devotion. But beneath the surface, the convent too hides its forbidden stories, because for some women, the convent wasn't just a sanctuary of prayer, it was also a loophole, a place where secret pregnancies could be concealed behind walls, sworn to silence. Picture a novice, barely 17, sent here by her family to avoid scandal. She kneels in prayer, hands clasped, but her belly betrays her. Officially, she is the bride of Christ, yet her condition tells a different tale. The other sisters notice. Some look away, others whisper in corners. and one or two will quietly bring her food or water during restless nights. The convent is supposed to protect her reputation, but at the same time, it becomes her cage. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Records from medieval Europe show that nuns were sometimes discovered with children, sparking enormous scandal. In the 14th century, investigations of convents in Germany and Italy exposed irregularities, including pregnancies, and in some cases, infants buried within cloister walls. Such findings shocked the public, but they also revealed how the convent was not the impenetrable fortress of purity that people imagined. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some convents, women gave birth in secret and then claimed the baby as an abandoned foundling delivered to their door. The sisters would raise the child as a ward of the convent, pretending it had no mother. Imagine the absurdity, everyone caring for the baby while tiptoeing around the obvious truth. Historians still argue whether convents were complicit sanctuaries for noble families seeking to hide scandals, or whether they were simply overwhelmed by the realities of women's lives. Some see them as willing conspirators protecting reputations at any cost. Others argue they were just cornered, forced to navigate impossible situations with compassion where society offered none. You walk through the cloister garden now, hearing the soft rustle of robes as nuns glide by, their eyes downcast. In one corner, a novice tends roses, her swollen form hidden beneath her habit. She plucks a blossom, thorns pricking her fingers, and you notice how her face twists between serenity and terror. At night, you can almost hear the cries muffled under hymns, a baby's wail swallowed by stone walls, a sister's whispered prayers blending with the sound of desperate rocking. The convent carries both holy chants and guilty secrets, and the echo doesn't care which is which. You pause in the chapel, the crucifix looming above. Even here, where purity is pledged and silence is sacred, human longing finds its way in. And when it does, women carry the same risk as everywhere else, only now the danger is multiplied by vows, by God's name invoked in every judgment, and by walls that protect and imprison at once. The chapel fades, and you drift into a chamber lined with shelves of glass vials, pewter bowls, and bundles of dried plants dangling like strange trophies from the rafters. This is not a convent or a cottage. It's the workspace of an early physician, one of those learned men who wore long gowns, muttered in Latin, and tried to straddle the line between science and superstition. Here, the air hums with questions that are never safe to ask aloud. Was this mixture medicine, or was it poison? He stands at the table now, grinding powder into liquid, explaining solemnly that he is restoring balance to the humours. That was the dominant medical belief of the time. Your body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much or too little of one, and illness set in. Pregnancy complications, miscarriages, even sudden infant death. These were explained not by biology but by imbalances of invisible fluids. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Many physicians prescribed emmenagogues, herbal remedies intended to bring on menstruation. These included pennyroyal, mugwort, and juniper. In polite terms, they were meant to regulate cycles. In practice, they were often used to end early pregnancies. Whether they worked depended on dosage, and dosing was where the real danger lived. Too weak, and nothing happened. Too strong, and the woman died before the secret she carried could ever be revealed. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some doctors recommended powdered beaver testicles mixed with wine as a fertility or anti-pregnancy aid. Don't ask how anyone discovered that. Picture someone raising a glass of suspiciously frothy red liquid and muttering, "bottoms up," for science. Historians still argue whether early physicians genuinely believed their concoctions were effective or whether they knowingly flirted with lethal outcomes. Were they saviors using the only tools they had, or were they executioners cloaked in respectability? It's hard to say, especially since surviving medical texts often glossed over what patients themselves whispered privately. You walk deeper into the room, listening to the physician mutter as he stirs a thick syrup, adding honey to disguise its bitterness. A young woman waits silently on a stool, her hands clenched together. eyes wide with fear. He offers her the cup. She drinks because what choice does she have? Her future depends on it, though she knows nothing of the calculation behind the dose. Was it prepared with care, or was it a guess scrawled from a dusty book? The room smells of sage and resin, but beneath it all is the sharp tang of mortality. Each sip could mean survival or a slow decline blamed on God's will. And the doctor, if she lives, he is praised for his wisdom. If she dies, he shrugs, claiming it was simply the balance of humours correcting itself. A convenient shield for a man whose hands were never truly at risk. You lean against the shelf, watching the candlelight flicker against glass vials. Medicine or poison, it's the same liquid, just separated by drops, and in that uncertain space, women balance their lives on trust, desperation, and the shaky Latin of men who promised more than they understood. The physician's chamber fades into darkness, and you're left with the question no remedy ever seemed to answer. Why were women the ones always paying the price? Shift your steps now into a busy street where men swagger past, laughing, their shoulders unburdened by the weight of rumour. Hidden fathers, those who shared in creating these secret pregnancies, often melted into the background, free to go on with their lives while women bore the punishment alone. Imagine it. A servant girl whispers her shame to the man who promised her affection. He nods solemnly, then vanishes at the first hint of scandal. She's left clutching her belly and her secret, while he continues drinking at taverns, telling jokes with friends, as though nothing ever happened. For him, it was a fleeting dalliance. For her, it's a lifelong sentence. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Bastardy laws across Europe placed financial responsibility almost entirely on the mother. In England, for example, parish officials could pursue alleged fathers for support, but these cases were notoriously hard to prove. Women were often forced to swear bastardy oaths, naming the father under threat of punishment if she lied. If she couldn't prove it, the child was her burden alone. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, if a woman accused a man of fathering her child, he could clear himself by swearing in court that he wasn't the father, while standing on a Bible and touching holy relics, basically a medieval version of cross my heart, hope to die. If he swore convincingly, he walked free. That's less paternity test, more theatre. Historians still argue whether these double standards were intentional systems to protect men, or simply the byproduct of patriarchal societies that didn't recognize women's voices as equal in the first place. Either way, the effect was clear. Men slipped through loopholes, while women were trapped in nets. You stand now at the edge of a tavern, listening as men joke over ale. One of them laughs, perhaps a little too loudly, trying to bury his own nervous guilt. The women in the corner glance over, some in pity, others in anger, knowing that if a girl leaves with him tonight, she may be the one to bear the cost. The men swagger home under torchlight, the weight of consequence sliding neatly off their shoulders. Meanwhile, in a narrow cottage across town, a young woman rocks in silence, her life overturned by the same man's easy smile. Her tears are swallowed by the dark because she knows the father's name means little when the system refuses to hear it. And so, hidden fathers remained hidden, not by chance but by design. Society looked away, preferring to place all the risk and all the blame squarely on the shoulders least able to carry it. The tavern noise fades and you step into a smaller, quieter room. Low beams overhead, a rush mat on the floor, and the unmistakable smell of linen boiled for too long. This is the midwife's chamber again, but the atmosphere has changed. It isn't about birthing now, it's about oaths, secrets, and the dangerous web in which midwives were caught. A woman clutches the midwife's hands, pleading. The child inside her cannot be known. The midwife's face is calm, but her pulse quickens. She has sworn an oath before her community, maybe even before a bishop, promising to report cases like this. And yet here is another woman, desperate and shaking. If she helps, she betrays her vow to the authorities. If she refuses, she betrays the ancient sisterhood of women who have always turned to her in their darkest hour. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Midwives in many regions of medieval Europe were required to swear loyalty to local officials. Their oaths often included promises to reveal illegitimate births, to baptize infants immediately if death was imminent, and to testify truthfully in court if called. They weren't just healers, they were agents of surveillance, pressed into service by law and church alike. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some towns actually issued midwives official badges or licenses like medieval hall passes to prove their legitimacy. But behind those respectable emblems, many midwives lived double lives, fulfilling their duties publicly while secretly protecting women in private. It was a balancing act as delicate as catching a newborn itself. Historians still argue whether midwives leaned more toward loyalty to the state or to their patients. Some records show midwives reporting women to authorities, their testimonies condemning them to punishment. Other accounts suggest midwives falsified records, claimed stillbirths when infants were alive, or swore ignorance about who the father might be. Perhaps the truth is that each midwife chose case by case when to uphold her oath and when to break it. You linger by the hearth as a young girl whispers her secret, tears streaking her face. The midwife listens, nods, then closes the shutters tight. She promises to help, but you can see the weight on her shoulders. Every promise she makes to a woman is a betrayal of the oath she made to the authorities. Every promise she keeps to the authorities is a betrayal of the women who trust her. You realize her life is built entirely on fragile trust. If the authorities discover she concealed a birth, she could be punished as harshly as the mother herself. If the community suspects her of betrayal, women will stop coming to her door. Either way, she risks everything: her livelihood, her reputation, maybe even her life. The room feels heavy, as though the walls themselves are listening. A single word, a single slip of the tongue could unravel everything. And so the midwife swears another oath, not to the bishop this time, not to the court, but silently to herself. She will carry this secret, even if it destroys her. The midwife's dim chamber dissolves, and now you're walking a dirt path that twists into darker woods. The air feels colder here, charged with suspicion, because when secrecy around pregnancy grew too thick, and when herbs or whispers failed to explain things, the easiest explanation people turned to was witchcraft, and that accusation carried dangers sharper than any knife. Picture this: a woman gives birth in secret, and the child doesn't survive. Neighbors hear muffled cries one night, then silence. By morning, the rumor mill spins. She must have called on dark powers. After all, what else could explain an infant's death or a pregnancy that appeared and disappeared without witnesses? Suddenly, she isn't just a sinner, she's a sorceress. Here's a mainstream historical fact. During the height of the witch trials in Europe, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, many accused women were midwives or single mothers. Their knowledge of herbs and their involvement in secret births made them easy scapegoats. Communities desperate for explanations pointed fingers, and courts eagerly supplied rope and fire. And here's a quirky tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe, women suspected of witchcraft were sometimes forced to carry pieces of iron under their clothing during questioning. The idea being that iron repelled magic. Imagine trying to defend your innocence while sweating under a hidden horseshoe. Historians still argue whether witchcraft accusations were genuinely about supernatural fear, or whether they were convenient tools to punish women who stepped outside society's rules. A pregnancy out of wedlock, a miscarriage, or even a woman's refusal to name a child's father could be twisted into evidence of consorting with demons. The line between biology and sorcery blurred wherever people wanted it to. You step deeper into the forest, hearing twigs snap underfoot. Imagine being her, dragged from your cottage, questioned under harsh eyes, asked whether you'd made pacts with devils. The same hands that once brewed pennyroyal tea or soothed a crying baby, now marked as tools of Satan. Even your cauldron, once an ordinary pot for soup, becomes evidence of malice. The cruelty here wasn't just in the trials, it was in how little chance women had to defend themselves. Secret pregnancies, already dangerous, became double-edged swords. Hide it and risk death from the herbs or childbirth. Reveal it and risk being accused of witchcraft. Either way, survival balanced on a thread thinner than a spider's web. You pause under the forest canopy, the trees looming like judges. Somewhere in the distance, you think you hear chanting, or maybe just the wind in the branches. The air smells of damp earth, but also of smoke, like a memory of pyres that once lit the night sky. Women's secrets turned into firewood, their risks twisted into curses. And you realize with a chill that for some, the price of a hidden pregnancy wasn't just shame or poverty. It was being consumed by flames they never lit. The forest smoke fades and you find yourself back in a narrow village street. This time the threat isn't pyres or magistrates, it's something quieter but no less deadly. Reputation. In a world where survival depended on community ties, one whispered rumor could unravel a woman's entire existence. The price of reputation was often higher than the price of life itself. Imagine you're a young woman with no family wealth to cushion you. Your good name is your only dowry. Suitors measure it like currency, employers weigh it like coin. But one suggestion, that you were seen slipping into a barn at dusk, or that your belly swells in suspicious ways, and the value of your name plummets. No suitor comes calling, no employer trusts you. Even relatives start keeping their distance, afraid your shame will rub off on them. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 18th century England, the reputation of chastity was so important that entire courts were dedicated to cases of defamation of character. Women sometimes sued neighbours for spreading rumours of illegitimacy or secret pregnancies, because once their reputation was tarnished, their futures were destroyed. The courts, however, rarely sided with women unless they were wealthy enough to make their voices heard. And here's a quirky tidbit. In parts of Scotland, women accused of loose behaviour were made to sit on special benches during church services, set apart from the congregation so everyone could stare at them. Imagine walking into church on Sunday, knowing your assigned seat announces your alleged sins before you even open your prayer book. Historians still argue whether reputation was genuinely tied to morality or if it was simply a convenient system of social control. After all, men's reputations could recover from scandal with a shrug and a pint. Women's, however, shattered like glass, impossible to piece back together. You step into the town square where merchants hawk their goods, and you notice the subtle choreography of gossip. A hand over a mouth, an eyebrow raised, a glance toward the girl walking quickly with her cloak drawn tight. She knows. She feels it. The silence behind her is louder than any shouted accusation, and once your reputation was gone, the world offered little chance of redemption. Some women turned to begging, others to workhouses, and many slipped into prostitution, not always by choice, but because society left them no other path. The cruel irony? The same neighbours who whispered about your shame might later condemn you again for the very survival strategies their whispers forced you into. You pause at a well-worn doorway, hearing faint laughter inside. Families sit together, eating bread, sharing stories, while the woman outside walks past with lowered eyes, excluded from all of it. Her name has become a brand burned into her skin. The air feels heavy here, not because of visible punishment, but because of invisible exile. In the end, reputation was a fragile glass mask. Once it cracked, the world never let you wear it again. The cracked mask of reputation slips away, and suddenly you're standing in a gilded chamber where velvet drapes pool on the floor and jeweled candelabras drip with melted wax. Here, the stakes of a secret pregnancy are not whispered reputations or village gossip, they are kingdoms. Behind these royal curtains, the danger of a woman's body could shake entire thrones. Imagine being a queen, her every breath measured by courtiers, her every glance dissected by ambassadors. Her body is not her own, it's the future of the realm. Every pregnancy is watched, documented and celebrated because it means heirs, stability and continuity. But what if a queen carries a child not belonging to her husband? Suddenly it isn't just scandal, it's treason. That child could inherit lands, armies, entire crowns, while carrying a bloodline that doesn't match the throne. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Royal courts across Europe often staged lying-in ceremonies where noble women and attendants were required to witness a queen's labour to ensure the legitimacy of the child. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, reportedly had dozens of witnesses crowd into her birthing chamber. Privacy wasn't allowed, not because anyone cared about her comfort, but because dynasties depended on her womb being beyond suspicion. And here's a quirky tidbit. In the court of Louis XIV, rumours once swirled that one of his mistresses had tried to pass off a child as the king's heir by smuggling it into the royal nursery. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire, and courtiers still gossiped about it decades later. Even the possibility of a swapped or secret child could set entire palaces buzzing with paranoia. Historians still argue whether queens and noblewomen had ways of manoeuvring around these restrictions, secret rooms, loyal servants, coded letters, or whether they were effectively imprisoned by their roles. Some point to whispered scandals where lovers were smuggled into bedchambers under disguises. Others insist such stories were inventions of enemies hoping to discredit powerful women. The truth, as always, is tangled in both reality and rumour. Walk with me through this palace now. Behind a curtain, a lady-in-waiting hushes an infant's cry, her hands trembling. In the corner, a servant hides scraps of linen still stained with birth. Above it all, the queen lies pale in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether the walls themselves will betray her. Outside, ambassadors speculate, courtiers whisper, ministers calculate. The child's legitimacy isn't just her secret, it's the kingdom's future. And kingdoms, unlike babies, do not forgive. The candles flicker against tapestries depicting battles and coronations, reminders that power is never private. Here, a single secret pregnancy could topple dynasties, send armies to war, or erase a woman from history entirely. You step back into the hallway, your shoes sinking into thick carpets. Yet even here, you feel the same weight as in the village square. The heavy knowledge that for women, desire was never just desire. It was always risk, magnified 100-fold if you wore a crown. The velvet curtains dissolve, and you find yourself in a smaller, dimmer chamber filled with parchment rolls and ink-stained quills. Here, the whispers of scandal give way to something stranger, ancient medical theories that once tried to explain women's bodies. This is the world of the wandering womb, an idea so bizarre it almost sounds like satire, except for the fact that physicians actually believed it. Picture this. A young woman faints or grows ill, and the explanation given isn't malnutrition or stress. No, the doctors insist her womb has literally begun wandering around her body like a lost traveller. If it strayed upward, it supposedly pressed on the lungs, causing shortness of breath. If it drifted near the heart, it triggered melancholy. The cure? Lure the womb back to its rightful place with sweet-smelling herbs placed near the thighs and foul odours waved beneath the nose. A medieval version of follow the scent trail home. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The theory of the wandering womb can be traced back to ancient Greece, particularly the writings of Hippocrates and later Galen. These ideas lingered well into the Middle Ages, influencing how doctors treated women for centuries. In practice, it meant that women's health was often seen as unstable, unpredictable, and mysterious, something to be controlled rather than understood. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some texts advised marriage as the ultimate cure for a restless womb. The reasoning was that frequent intercourse and pregnancy would anchor the womb in place. Imagine being told your uterus is basically a runaway balloon that needs tying down by matrimony. A convenient theory if you're a man looking to reinforce social rules, less convenient if you're the woman being diagnosed. Historians still argue whether physicians truly believed these theories or if they used them as convenient tools to justify limiting women's autonomy. After all, if you convince society that a woman's body is inherently unstable, you can argue that she needs constant supervision, marriage, and childbearing just to stay healthy. You linger near the desk as a physician scribbles notes by candlelight, his words filled with authority but his understanding painfully limited. Behind him, a young woman sits pale and silent, her supposed wandering womb, really just exhaustion from carrying secrets too heavy to bear. The irony here is sharp. While women risked their lives with secret pregnancies, the men tasked with treating them were chasing phantom theories. They debated wombs like migrating birds, prescribing odors and marriages instead of listening to the real dangers women faced: poverty, shame, and the very real risk of death in childbirth. The candle gutters and the physician mutters something about humours and vapours. You step away from his desk, shaking your head. The wandering womb may have been an illusion, but its consequences were all too real, shaping laws, justifying restrictions, and keeping women tethered to roles they couldn't escape. The physician's quill scratches fade, and now you hear the faint laughter of children echoing down a cobbled alley. But this laughter carries an edge because it belongs to those born outside the rules, illegitimate children, branded from birth with the weight of their parents' secrets. Society called it the orphan's curse, though most of these children weren't orphans at all. Their mothers were alive, their fathers too. But the law pretended otherwise. Picture a small boy in a patched tunic, running after the other village children. When he stumbles, their giggles turn cruel. "Bastard," they whisper, a word heavier than any stone. He doesn't fully understand it, but he feels its sting every time. He's marked not by his deeds, but by the circumstances of his birth, something he never chose. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Across medieval and early modern Europe, illegitimate children were barred from inheriting property unless legitimized by special decree. In England, the law of filius nullius, literally the child of no one, meant a bastard had no legal father, no claim to lineage, no standing in noble succession. They were ghosts in legal terms, erased from the family tree, even if everyone knew exactly whose blood ran in their veins. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some Italian cities, foundlings were given surnames like Innocenti, innocent, or Orfanelli, little orphan. On one hand, it softened the blow. On the other, it broadcast their status everywhere they went. Imagine filling out a form today with the surname illegitimate. Every introduction would be a confession. Historians still argue whether the stigma came more from the church or from secular law. Did canon law's obsession with purity drive it, or was it families trying to protect wealth and titles from being divided? Likely both. But what's certain is that the burden always fell hardest on the child, labelled, excluded, and often destined for poverty regardless of their talents. You pause at the edge of a village square. There's a schoolmaster teaching his pupils, but the illegitimate boy isn't allowed inside. He hovers by the doorway, craning his neck to see the slateboard, wishing he could join. His mother pulls him away, embarrassed, whispering that he mustn't draw attention. The boy lowers his eyes, already learning to live smaller, quieter. And yet not all of them faded into shadows. Some bastards rose to surprising heights, soldiers, poets, even kings. William the Conqueror himself was branded William the Bastard before he became Conqueror of England. Still, the exception only highlighted the rule. Most illegitimate children never escaped the curse. You walk away, the sound of laughter still chasing your ears, but it feels different now. It isn't innocent anymore. It's the echo of a cruelty that society carved into children's lives simply because their mothers had loved or been forced outside the lines. The children's laughter fades into a slower, sadder sound, the strum of a lute and the soft murmur of a ballad drifting through a tavern door. You step inside and find the place dimly lit, smoke curling toward the rafters where travellers trade stories and musicians sing. Not all history was written in laws or court documents. Some of it lived in songs, ballads, and folk tales, and many of those tales carried warnings for women about dangerous love and secret pregnancies. Picture a bard in a threadbare cloak, his voice weaving through the room. The verses tell of a maiden who met her lover by moonlight, only to be abandoned when her belly grew round. She wanders the countryside, shunned by her kin, clutching her child until tragedy claims them both. The refrain is haunting, repeated in every town. Love will ruin you if you let it cross the boundaries set by God and man. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Popular ballads from the 16th and 17th centuries often carried moral warnings about illicit romance. Songs like The Unfortunate Rake or The Cruel Mother spread across Europe, retold and reshaped by each community. These ballads were entertainment, yes, but also cultural policing, reminding everyone what happened when women strayed. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some rural villages, girls were actually made to sing these ballads during festivals or harvest feasts. Imagine standing in front of your neighbors forced to belt out a cautionary tune about a pregnant girl abandoned in shame. It's karaoke night with a medieval moral lesson tacked on. Historians still argue whether these songs reflected reality or created it. Were they mirrors of women's real suffering, or were they tools to frighten others into obedience? The line is blurred because ballads worked both ways, recording tragedy while also reinforcing the boundaries that made those tragedies inevitable. You lean on a tavern beam as the lute twangs and the lyrics sink in. Around you, villagers nod along knowingly. Some laugh, some sigh, but everyone understands the lesson. A woman's body was not her own. It was the property of her reputation, her family, her community. And if she risked secret love, the songs promised she would pay. The bard's voice cracks on the final verse. The maiden's ghost wandering in the night, her child buried in unmarked earth. The tavern grows quiet, the moral heavy in the air. Then someone claps, mugs slam on tables, and conversation resumes. Because for the audience, it's entertainment. For the women listening, it's a threat wrapped in melody. You step outside into the cool night. The music lingers in your ears, carrying with it centuries of whispered warnings. Songs and ballads were never just tunes to pass the time. They were cultural chains, sung into women's bones, teaching them to fear the very love they longed for. The tavern door closes behind you, but the echoes of that ballad don't fade. They sharpen into something harsher, more official. You step into a drafty hall where benches creak, candles sputter, and stern faces peer down from a raised platform. This is a courtroom, though it feels more like a stage. Tonight's performance isn't music, it's a trial. And the subject is purity. At the center stands a woman pale and trembling, accused of carrying a child conceived outside marriage, but the court doesn't stop at accusation. No, they stage a kind of theater designed to prove or disprove her virtue. The spectators lean forward, hungry for drama, while clerks sharpen quills to record every humiliating detail. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Early modern courts often subjected women to invasive examinations in cases of alleged fornication, rape, or illegitimacy. Virginity tests were conducted by midwives or matrons who declared in front of judges whether a woman's body appeared pure. The results were notoriously unreliable but carried enormous weight. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some German courts in the 16th century used a bizarre method called the bread and cheese ordeal. A woman accused of concealing pregnancy would be forced to swallow a lump of dry bread and cheese under oath. If she choked, it was taken as proof of guilt. Forget DNA testing. This was medieval science at its most absurd. Historians still argue whether these spectacles were intended to seek truth or to reinforce control, because the outcome rarely mattered. If the woman passed, she was still tarnished by suspicion. If she failed, she was condemned outright. Either way, her reputation lay in ruins by the time the court adjourned. You lean against the back wall as the woman on trial is ordered to walk across the floor, her gait scrutinized for signs of recent childbirth. A midwife whispers to the judge. The crowd murmurs. Every gesture, every tremor of her hands becomes evidence. It's less a trial than a public dissection of her life. The cruelty is sharpened by the absurdity. Imagine being forced to prove purity through rituals that had no scientific grounding, all while your neighbors watched. It wasn't justice, it was theater, and you were the unwilling star. The gavel slams, the hall empties, and the woman is left alone, her name forever changed. You step outside into the cold night, realizing that the court didn't need to find her guilty. The trial itself had already delivered the punishment, her humiliation, carved into memory, whispered at wells, sung in taverns and passed down for years. The courtroom doors close behind you, but the silence they leave isn't comforting. It's heavy. You walk through the dim streets until you hear another kind of hush, deeper and more intimate, the confessional. A wooden booth with carved lattice panels, a place where women whispered their darkest fears to men who promised forgiveness. But in the age of secret pregnancies, even confession wasn't safe. Picture kneeling on the cold stone floor, your heart hammering as you admit to the priest that your belly carries a secret. His voice, muffled through the lattice, responds with solemn words of penance. But what you don't see is the storm inside him, the vow of confidentiality colliding with the pressure to maintain moral order. Should he protect your secret or expose it for the good of the community? Here's a mainstream historical fact. While the Catholic Church officially required priests to keep the seal of confession, never revealing what they heard, there are records of priests hinting or outright breaking that vow when confronted with pregnancies outside marriage. In smaller parishes, the line between spiritual counsel and social policing blurred. A whispered sin could easily become a whispered rumor. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, priests were expected to keep a tally of carnal sins confessed in their parishes, reporting the numbers, though not the names, up the chain. Imagine your private shame reduced to a kind of clerical statistic, scribbled on parchment alongside tallies of stolen chickens and missed masses. Historians still argue whether priests leaned more toward mercy or betrayal in these situations. Some documents suggest priests quietly guided women towards sympathetic midwives or foundling wheels, turning confession into a lifeline. Others hint that priests used these secrets to pressure women, or worse, to threaten them into silence. You sit quietly in the pews now, listening as faint voices murmur from within the booth. The woman inside speaks too softly for you to catch every word, but you hear the desperation in her tone. She isn't just asking forgiveness, she's begging for her life not to unravel. On the other side, the priest exhales, his hands gripping the edge of the lattice. He has power not only over her soul, but over her survival. Outside, villagers light candles, kneel in prayer, and believe the church is a refuge. But for some women, stepping into the confessional meant gambling everything, because the wrong priest or the wrong whisper could turn absolution into accusation. You leave the chapel slowly, the scent of incense clinging to your clothes. Behind you, the confessional remains dark and quiet, but you know its silence is deceptive. In this world, even God's supposed secrecy could be pierced, and the words you whispered in faith could echo far louder than you ever intended. The incense lingers in your clothes as you step back into the night, but the darkness is less comforting now. Because sometimes the danger didn't come from priests or courts. It came from the very people who shared your street, your well, your fields, the neighbors who decided justice themselves. When whispers hardened into certainty, entire communities could turn executioner. Picture this. A woman suspected of concealing a pregnancy is dragged from her cottage at dawn. There is no trial, no parchment signed by magistrates, just a cluster of neighbors armed with sticks, stones, and fury. They march her to the edge of the village, shouting that her sin has cursed their crops, that her silence insults their honor. In their eyes, she isn't just guilty, she's dangerous. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In parts of early modern Europe, communities often took justice into their own hands. Women accused of infanticide or secret births were sometimes lynched or drowned without formal trial. Records from Germany and Scotland in the 16th century describe mobs forcing women into rivers to test their guilt. If they floated, they were witches or murderers. If they sank, they were innocent, but also dead. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some alpine villages, a woman rumoured to have hidden a pregnancy might wake, to find effigies of herself hung outside her door, crudely made dolls stuffed with straw, sometimes with swollen bellies drawn on. A medieval prank? More like psychological warfare, a warning that the whole town was watching her every move. Historians still argue whether these mob punishments reflected true communal belief in justice, or whether they were fueled by fear and boredom. Was it religious fervor? A need for scapegoats during hard harvests? Or simply the cruelty of crowds when given a target? The answer, likely, shifts with each case, but the outcome was always the same. The woman bore the punishment, while the man responsible disappeared into the anonymity of the crowd. You stand at the village edge now, watching as a group of men and women shove a terrified figure toward the water. The shouts blend with the roar of the river, their faces lit by torchlight, their fury masked as righteousness. No law stands here, only the jagged rhythm of fear and control. And when it's done, whether she drowns or stumbles home broken, the village will return to its routines. Bread will be baked, cattle milked, gossip traded, as though nothing extraordinary happened. But the silence will be thick, and every woman who watched will feel the warning burn into her bones. Stay hidden or risk the same fate. The river rushes on uncaring, carrying secrets downstream. You turn away, chilled, realizing that for women in this world, safety wasn't only denied by laws or priests, it could vanish in an instant at the hands of neighbors who mistook cruelty for justice. The roar of the river fades, replaced by the hum of a marketplace. Stalls are crowded with baskets of spices, glass vials and bundles of herbs, tied in string. Here, medicine and superstition blur together, sold side by side with gossip. This is where desperate women came quietly, coins clenched in sweaty palms, searching for powders and potions whispered to fix their problems. The market stall was as much a pharmacy as it was a confessional. Picture it. A woman in a rough cloak leans across the table, pretending to inspect onions while whispering her true request. The merchant doesn't blink. He reaches under the stall and brings out a packet of ground roots or a vial of cloudy oil. No labels, no instructions, just a warning muttered through crooked teeth. Too much will kill you, too little will do nothing. She nods, swallows hard, and slips it into her basket beneath the bread. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Apothecaries and street vendors in the Middle Ages often sold substances known as emmenagogues, intended to bring on menstruation. These ranged from pennyroyal and tansy to concoctions laced with mercury or lead. Many of them were toxic, but they persisted because they offered women one of the few options available outside formal medicine. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some stalls sold magic charms alongside herbs, tiny wax figurines, knotted cords, or even animal bones wrapped in cloth, claimed to ward off unwanted pregnancies. To modern ears it sounds absurd, but in desperate times even superstition felt worth the gamble. Sometimes the ritual was as important as the potion itself, giving women a fragile sense of control. Historians still argue whether merchants knew they were selling poison or whether they genuinely believed in the remedies they offered. Some were likely cynical opportunists preying on women's fear for profit. Others may have thought their powders worked, passing down recipes from older generations without ever questioning their effects. Either way, the market stall became a crossroads of survival and danger. You wander deeper into the crowd, hearing whispers stitched into the hum of haggling. She went to old Marta's stall last week. She hasn't been seen since. The air smells of crushed rosemary, stale fish, and hot wax. Coins clink, cloth rustles. Behind every transaction is a story that will never be told aloud. Imagine drinking one of those concoctions at home. It burns down your throat, leaving bitterness that lingers for hours. You wait, clutching your stomach, praying it works, terrified that it won't, or worse, that it will work too well. Outside, the marketplace continues, oblivious to your private battle. As you step away from the stalls, you realize how many lives balanced on these tiny bundles of powder, wrapped in paper or cloth. For some, they were a lifeline. For others, they were a death sentence, and no one ever knew which until it was too late. The marketplace dissolves, and suddenly you're standing near a smoky camp where soldiers rest by their fires. Armor clinks, dice roll on overturned helmets, and the smell of roasted meat drifts on the wind. War has always been a furnace of chaos, and in that chaos women often risked everything. When armies marched through towns or camped outside villages, encounters were rarely gentle, and the pregnancies that followed carried dangers unlike any others. Imagine it, a woman left behind while her husband fought miles away. Soldiers arrive, some offering coin, some taking without asking. For her, the choice is a cruel one: submit and risk a child conceived in violence, or refuse and risk her life. And if a child comes of it, there is no protecting her secret in a community that already suspects every glance, every absence. Here's a mainstream historical fact. During the 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe, accounts describe widespread sexual violence against women, resulting in countless unacknowledged pregnancies. Many children born of such encounters were abandoned or killed, not out of malice, but because their existence made survival impossible. Chroniclers noted villages where half the children resembled foreign troops who had marched through. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some soldiers believed drinking gunpowder mixed with wine acted as a crude aphrodisiac before encounters. The practice was dangerous and often fatal, but the myth persisted. Imagine staggering into a woman's cottage after swallowing a concoction that made your heart race, another reckless layer in already desperate situations. Historians still argue whether women in wartime were more vulnerable or, paradoxically, more liberated. In some cases, war broke down social structures so completely that women had fleeting opportunities for independence. In others, the collapse of order left them exposed to exploitation with no protection at all. The truth is tangled, written in stories too fragmented to tally. You walk among the tents now. A girl in ragged dress slips into the shadows, clutching her cloak tightly. Her eyes dart, scanning for someone she cannot name as father, someone who may already be dead on a battlefield. Her secret grows inside her, yet in a camp full of noise no one notices. Or maybe they notice and simply don't care. And when the war moves on, she's left behind, pregnant, abandoned, condemned. The soldiers march to new battles, singing songs and laughing. She remains, facing whispers and punishments, as though she alone created the child. Her survival depends on silence, but silence is brittle when the whole village stares. You pause by the fire, hearing men's laughter ripple into the night. For them, war will be remembered in victories and defeats, in treaties and maps. For her, it will be remembered as the moment life changed forever, marked not by glory, but by a risk she never chose. The soldiers' campfire smoke thins, and soon you find yourself beneath the rough-hewn beams of a wooden house in a distant colony. The year is no longer medieval, it's the age of ships and settlements, when Europe carried its rules across oceans. You might think new worlds meant new freedoms, but for women, the old cruelties followed like shadows. Colonies became mirrors of Europe, repeating the same punishments for secret pregnancies, only now under harsher conditions. Picture a young servant girl in Jamestown or New England, indentured for years to work off her passage. She bends over in the fields, belly swelling under her apron. Her master notices. The contract she signed forbids pregnancy. It disrupts labor and risks extra mouths to feed. The punishment? Her term of service is extended, sometimes doubled. For her, love or even coercion meant not freedom, but more years of bondage. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 17th century Virginia, female servants who became pregnant outside of marriage were often whipped and forced to serve additional years. Their children were bound out as servants too, ensuring the cycle of punishment passed to the next generation. Colonial law showed no mercy for women's bodies, especially those without wealth or power. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Puritan New England, some towns used birthing stools as punishment. A woman suspected of secret pregnancy might be forced to sit on one in front of the congregation, not to give birth, but to confess her sin publicly. Imagine perching on a wooden chair designed for labor, while neighbors stared and the minister thundered from the pulpit. That's humiliation carved into furniture. Historians still argue whether colonial societies were harsher because of survival pressures, small communities couldn't afford scandal, or because the distance from Europe gave leaders even more unchecked power. What's clear is that women's risks didn't lessen in the New World. If anything, they multiplied under stricter eyes. You walk through a settlement street now, timber houses lean against one another, smoke curls from chimneys, and children run barefoot through the mud. Yet every eye lingers on the servant girl walking quickly with her shawl pulled tight. They whisper the same words her cousins in Europe once heard. Oceans couldn't drown the old judgments. In some ways, the colonies amplified them. With fewer people, everyone's business became everyone's concern. A swelling belly was impossible to hide when the entire town counted heads in church every Sunday. The minister preached purity with more fire, the magistrate enforced law with more severity, and the gossip was louder for lack of anything else to distract. You pause outside the meeting house, hearing a hymn float out into the night. The sound is solemn, almost peaceful, yet beneath it lies the same truth. Even thousands of miles from the old world, women could not escape its grip. Secret pregnancies still meant punishment, still meant whispers, still meant survival, gambled in silence. The hymn drifts away, and with it the strict wooden houses of the colonies. You find yourself moving forward in time, into the streets of 18th and 19th century Europe, where the first faint cracks begin to show in the old system. The punishments for secret pregnancies didn't vanish, but slowly, so slowly, you can sense reform creeping in, carried by pamphlets, preachers, and a few stubborn voices who dared to argue that maybe, just maybe, cruelty wasn't the best way to enforce morality. Imagine a London alley in the 1700s. Posters are plastered on walls, advertising lying in hospitals where women could give birth anonymously. They weren't perfect, conditions were rough, and stigma still clung like mud. But they were at least an alternative to drowning or abandonment. A woman desperate to hide her pregnancy might slip inside and, for the first time in history, find an institution that didn't immediately brand her as criminal. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 1756, the Foundling Hospital in London began admitting women and their infants, part of a broader movement toward charitable care. It wasn't entirely altruistic. Strict rules applied, and many mothers had to surrender their children permanently, but it represented a shift from punishment toward limited compassion. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some lying-in hospitals required women to leave a token with their child, a button, a scrap of cloth, even half of a playing card, so that if they ever returned, the baby could be identified. Many of these tokens survive in museum collections today, silent symbols of heartbreak preserved in glass cases. Historians still argue whether these reforms were driven by genuine empathy or by practical concerns. Was it about saving souls and infants, or about keeping desperate women from resorting to infanticide that horrified polite society? Likely both. Philanthropists wrote stirring essays, but beneath them lay the same unease. Society wasn't ready to grant women freedom, only slightly gentler punishments. You walk through a reformed ward now, rows of iron beds, women lying pale and exhausted, nuns bustling about with bowls of broth. The air smells of carbolic soap, a faint whiff of modern cleanliness that feels almost revolutionary compared to damp cottages and whispered herbs. And yet the sorrow still lingers. Many of these women will leave without their babies, forced to return to life as if nothing happened, carrying silence heavier than any bundle of cloth. Step outside, and the city feels louder. Carriages rattle, street hawkers shout, newspapers rustle with headlines. But in the shadows of reform, the old dangers haven't vanished. Women still risk shame, still risk whispers, still gamble with their lives. The only difference is that now, slowly, a few cracks appear in the walls, tiny spaces where light, however faint, begins to seep in. The echo of carriage wheels fades, and you find yourself stepping into a new kind of room, brighter, lined with bookshelves and anatomical charts pinned to the walls. It smells less of incense and gossip, more of ink and antiseptic. This is the 19th century edging into the 20th, the moment when science begins to push aside superstition. Slowly, painfully, Medicine starts replacing charms, bread and cheese ordeals, and wandering wombs. But for women, the risks of secret pregnancies remain tangled in this new landscape. Imagine a young doctor in a stiff white coat explaining pregnancy with diagrams instead of parables. He talks about sperm cells and ova, words borrowed from microscopes instead of sermons. He prescribes tonics, advises rest, and scoffs at the old idea of a womb wandering around the body. Yet when a woman comes to him quietly, desperate to end a pregnancy that society won't forgive, he hesitates. Science may have advanced, but laws and morality still pin her down. Here's a mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, many countries began passing strict anti-abortion laws, even as medical knowledge improved. In Britain, the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act made abortion a criminal act punishable by life imprisonment. Similar statutes spread across Europe and America. Ironically, the more doctors understood reproduction, the more governments clamped down on women's ability to control it. And here's a quirky tidbit. Victorian health manuals sometimes recommended that women avoid novels if they wanted to keep their reproductive systems steady. Apparently, too much imagination could overstimulate the womb, so if pennyroyal tea didn't ruin you, Jane Austen might. Historians still argue whether the rise of medical authority helped women or hurt them. On one hand, professional doctors replaced shady market stall vendors, reducing some risks. On the other, male physicians often pushed midwives aside, stripping women of a traditional support network and replacing it with cold, institutional control. Compassion was traded for charts and regulations. You stand now in a clinic hallway, the tile floor echoing under your steps. A young woman waits on a bench, clutching her gloves. She hopes science will save her, yet she knows it may condemn her just as swiftly. The doctor who treats her today could either offer discreet help or report her to authorities. The gamble hasn't disappeared, it's only changed costume. Outside, the world buzzes with invention. Trains thunder past, electric lamps flicker to life, telegraphs click. Progress seems unstoppable. And yet beneath it all, women still slip into back rooms, still whisper to midwives, still carry secrets in silence. Science may have explained the body better, but society hasn't loosened its grip. You pause at the clinic door, hearing the rattle of a cart outside and the murmur of nurses within. The language has changed, the tools have sharpened, but the risk remains the same. For women with secret pregnancies, knowledge brought new hope and new dangers. The tiled hallway dissolves into something quieter, softer. The clinic doors close, and now you find yourself in a room lit by a single lamp, its glow spilling over a wooden desk stacked with papers. The centuries of whispers and punishments you've walked through condense here into one final truth. Echoes. Even as laws soften and medicine advances, the shadows of those secret risks linger in the way society still talks about women, motherhood, and shame. Imagine a woman in the early 20th century walking quickly down a city street with her hat brim pulled low. The world around her hums with automobiles, gramophones, electric lights. And yet, her secret feels no less heavy than the one carried by a medieval girl slipping into a midwife's cottage. Modernity has arrived, but judgment hasn't disappeared. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Even well into the 20th century, unmarried mothers in Europe and America faced stigma that shaped their entire lives. Many were sent to mother and baby homes, institutions that promised care but often forced women into unpaid labor, pressured them to surrender their infants, and erased their identities in the name of morality. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Ireland, some of these institutions used laundry work as penance. Women washed sheets and garments endlessly. Their sweat meant to cleanse their sin. The irony, of course, is painful. Shame turned into literal soap and water. Historians still argue whether reform truly freed women or simply wrapped the same restrictions in new packaging. Did science and social change finally bring compassion, or did they just exchange firewood and gossip for paperwork and clinics? Even now, debates rage over autonomy, morality, and who gets to decide the worth of a woman's choices. You sit quietly in this final room, the lamp glowing low. Outside, modern streets murmur with radios, neon signs, and laughter drifting from cafes. But inside you hear echoes, centuries of whispers behind shutters, of bells tolling for foundlings, of songs warning girls not to love too freely. The stories don't vanish, they linger, shaping how people still talk about pregnancy, motherhood, and secrecy today. The light softens and you lean back, letting your breath slow. The journey has carried you through shadows, courts, convents, markets, and palaces, and all along the thread was the same. Women risking everything for the most human of experiences. Some survived, many didn't. All left traces that still hum beneath the surface of history. And now, in this moment, you can let it rest. The lamp flickers lower, the pages curl gently on the desk, and the echoes fade into silence. So now, as the last voices fade, let's ease together into the stillness of night. You've walked through centuries of hidden rooms and heavy whispers, felt the weight of fear pressing through candlelit walls, and listened to secrets carried on the breath of women long gone. Their stories are jagged, yes, but here, in the quiet, they soften into memory. Let your breath slow. Each inhale feels steady, each exhale a little lighter. The dangers and punishments, the gossip and fear, they belong to the past. Tonight, they're only distant shadows flickering at the edge of your imagination, dissolving like smoke into the dark. You don't need to hold them anymore. Imagine yourself now in a safer place. Perhaps it's a meadow at dusk, the sky washed in lavender and soft gold. Perhaps it's a quiet room where the only sound is the hush of wind against the window. Wherever it is, picture yourself there, far from watchful eyes, far from judgment. The air is calm, and nothing is asked of you except to rest. The ground beneath you feels steady, cool, and kind. You sink into it a little more with each breath, as if the earth itself is carrying your weight for you. The world outside slows and the silence wraps around you like a soft blanket. The echoes of history drift further and further away until they're no more than a faint hum, a lullaby sung by time itself. The lamp dims, the meadow darkens, and your body feels loose, heavy, ready for sleep. So let go, close your eyes, drift where the stories can't follow. And as the night gathers you in, remember, you are safe, you are still, and you are free to rest.